So today I'm going to be talking about music and language. And while some might think that this lecture was going to be about the setting of language, I'm sorry to disappoint you. It's not really going to be about that. It's about how language can be approached through music, and in particular Samuel Beckett's language. I think when a composer is dealing with a major writer such as Beckett, there's always a kind of a trepidation, and for many years it was something that I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to approach Beckett at some stage. I should say that despite Beckett's apparent complexity, you know, Beckett is quite revered in Ireland. He was exiled from Ireland, self-exiled for many years, but Beckett is almost like a household name, more than a household name. We quote Beckett unconsciously. We kind of grew up with Beckett. There might be something in the Irish psyche or in the Irish mentality that suits Beckett, or Beckett suits us. Why should it be a surprise he was Irish? But we even knew the notion of Beckett as adjective. You know, even as young people, we knew that when something was quite Beckettian. I guess that's a mark of a great writer. It's a bit like someone recognizing that something is Kafkaesque. You know, K is enough. Just to say the letter K is almost enough to understand a whole worldview. And Beckett sort of comes into that. So I was very, very interested in, at some stage, tackling Beckett. But it was always something that I kept at arm's length. That changed when I heard a recitation of Beckett's last poem called What is the Word?, which I will recite for you soon. And I was quite astonished that Beckett, in his 80s, was still asking this question. I found the performance was by Barry McGovern, and I was completely blown away. And I think it was at that moment that I realised I was going to have to deal with this. But I also immediately knew that I couldn't just set Beckett to music as in song. That was not going to happen. I also knew that Beckett's writing, a bit like Mozart's music, was almost just perfect. So one note out and you've ruined the piano sonata in C. You know, there was something so perfectly wrought about Beckett's writing that meant that I had to really consider deeply how I was going to tackle this. We'll be talking about three pieces that I composed over a period of about 6 months, but the decision to tackle Beckett had been 2.5 years earlier. So the entire project took 3 years. And although I was quite familiar with Beckett, I started this research by reading everything that Beckett had written, and I mean everything, and to try and find a doorway into his world. And I read many essays as well about him and so forth, and I read his, the two main biographies and so forth. So I really entered into Beckett's world. And entering into Beckett's world made me realise that I could not ever really penetrate it as a musician, so I would have to weave music in and around his words and not set them. But as the more I researched my Beckett, I became very attracted to his later aesthetics. I think, as I mentioned earlier in a previous talk, Beckett was really trying to find what lay behind language. His whole notion of fail again, fail better was really interesting because he's the first artist who sort of admits failure so brilliantly in his art that I think he instinctively knew that language was restricted in some way, and the older he got, the more he wrote, the less he wrote. In fact, he let silence come into his world. He says of Waiting for Godot that silence seeps into the play like water into a sinking ship. And that in a way sums up Beckett as he gets older. I think he more consciously realised that language could only go so far. And I think what he wanted to do was trying to find what human consciousness was really all about through language. But as I've mentioned before in a lecture on improvisation, language is the very thing that restricts consciousness. So I think he knew this, and so he had built into his artistic endeavour a failure, and he knew about it, which is why he talks of failure all the time, but it's also astonishing that he kept going. This is why I think Beckett's negativity is in fact a positivity. When he says know how on, I always think of this, know how on, meaning there's no way I can go on. That term still finishes with the opposite word to which it starts. No on. Same with worstwood ho. Worstwood is the worst possible direction you can go in, but let's tarry fort. And so he had this way of failing so amazingly well. So this became a very interesting point. So anyway, I think the idea then of him embracing silence became very important, because then I think it brought his language closer to music. So it became clear to me that in actual fact, taking on Beckett as a composer was really taking on language, was finding the liminal spaces between where language ends and perhaps where music continues. Because when you see what Beckett does in his later works, where he breaks down the grammar of sentences, he introduces silence into his language. Sentences are unfinished. Words are used as much for their sonic quality as they are for their so-called grammatical meaning. He's pushing language closer to music. When you break down words, you're breaking down sentences into words, words into phonemes, phonemes into sound fragments of words. They lose their grammatical sense, but they're gaining a musical sense. So it became clear to me that this relationship between language and silence could be explored. Just to give you an idea of Beckett's thinking, I just want to read out one or two comments that he made. So he says, this is Beckett speaking, the more Joyce knew, the more he could. He's tending towards omniscience and omnipotence as an artist. I'm working with impotence, ignorance. I don't think impotence has been exploited in the past. There seems to be a kind of aesthetic axiom that expression is an achievement, must be an achievement. My little exploration is that whole zone of being that has always been set aside by artists as something unusable, as something by definition incompatible with art. I think anyone nowadays, anybody who pays the slightest attention to his own experience, finds it the experience of the non-knower, the non-canner, the person who can't do. So this is, for me, this admission by Beckett sums up his late aesthetics, that he was no longer really interested in writing the perfect sentences, the perfect novels, because he wanted language to do more than just be perfect in itself. He wanted language to somehow exist beyond the radar signals of language, which it could be argued is exactly where music resides. So let me give you an example of this. Let me read out this poem that really ignited my desire to tackle Beckett as a composer. So this is What is the Word? Beckett's last poem. Folly, folly for two, what is the word? Folly from this, all this, folly from all this, given, folly given all this, seeing, folly seeing all this, this, what is the word? This here, all this here, folly given all this, seeing, folly seeing all this here, for two, what is the word? See, glimpse, seem to glimpse, need to seem to glimpse, folly for to need to seem to glimpse, what? What is the word? And where? Folly for to need to seem to glimpse what? Where? Where? What is the word? There, over there, away over there, afar away over there, a faint, afar away over there, what? What? What is the word? Seeing all this here, folly for to see what? Glimpse, seem to glimpse, need to seem to glimpse, a faint, afar away over there, what? Folly for to need to seem to glimpse, a faint, afar away over there, what? What? What is the word? What is the word? So that poem, What is the Word, really encapsulates all these elements that I was mentioning earlier about Beckett's late aesthetics, and it not only inspired me to tackle Beckett, but also provided the template and the basis for understanding Beckett and trying to find that space between, or that space where language morphs into music, the place where silence has as much meaning as the word that preceded the silence. So I ended up composing three pieces, and I'll just explain those three pieces now. The first is, surprise, surprise, it's called What is the Word? But the full title is What is the Word? Triptych with Interludes. And for this piece, I set three texts. The first is Neither, which some of you may recognize as the libretto for Morton Feldman's opera. The second is from Worstwood Ho, an excerpt, the first 158 words that start on, the word on, and end with still, on, still, again moving on and being still, which I thought was very Beckettian framing. And I finish with What is the Word? I have two interludes in between those three pieces, so it's a 5-movement work. And what I wanted to do, the form of the piece came to me very, very quickly, actually, one night, where fragments of words would emerge out of music, and eventually the narrator would start reciting the poem Neither. I should say at this point that the piece is composed for double bass, performed by Barry Guy, violin with Maya Homburger, guitar and prepared guitar with myself, and narrator, which was taken on in the recording by Conor Lovett. So the piece works as an archway, sort of in an arch, where language and music intermingle almost at the very early stages of pronunciation of language. And then that feeds into the first poem, Neither. Then there's an interlude, and then music that feeds into a much more intense delivery of the excerpt from Worstwood Ho. This is the point where, in a way, language is at its most intense. And then after the second interlude, we have a setting of What is the Word, which fades into the closing music. So we have this arch from music into intense recitation and back down again with interludes in the middle. So that's the general shape of the piece. So I speak about this liminal space between music and language, the idea that maybe that language can emerge out of music. And I tried to capture this in the first movement called Neither, as I've mentioned. So let's have a listen to this, and I have the score on screen as well for you.
fro in shadow, from inner to outer shadow, from impenetrable self to impenetrable unself, by way of neither. As between two lit refuges whose doors once neared, gently close, once turned away from, gently part again. Beckoned back and forth and turned away, heedless of the way, intent on the one gleam or the other. Unheard footfalls only sound, till at last halt for good, absent for good from self and other. Then no sound. Then gently light unfading on that unheeded neither. Unspeakable home.
The shared space between music and language is really the theme of neither, and it's the way that language emerges out of music and vice versa that has influenced the structure of that movement. I just want to mention another element that we can talk about in terms of being the composer and dealing with Beckett's techniques. Is I mentioned it earlier about how Beckett in a way reuses material. You know, Worsted Hoe is an extraordinarily dense text where Beckett has a kind of a bank of words and sentences that get reused again. It's almost like he's hammering away at language to try and get to the answers. And I was trying to capture this in some way. The way he repeats things as well. He repeats the same terms but with different meanings. I was at Happy Days just a night or two ago, and Winnie constantly says, and Winnie, what does she say? She says, I used to think. I say, I used to think. That sort of reworking of the same words but with completely different meanings. And I mentioned about know-how on earlier, this term know-how on, which is N-O-H-O-W, know-how. There's no way on. But in terms of phonetics, it could be to have know-how, K-N-O-W-H-O-W, to have the know-how to move on. And then I talked about its the notion of the no and the on being opposites and being ambiguous. So there's this wonderful digging into language with Beckett, where even a small term or phrase, if it's a phrase, two words, know how on, could mean multiple things. And I tried to capture that in my music, particularly in this piece, which is near the end of the first interlude. So basically it's the same music repeated several times but with different articulations and different volumes, almost like like a band coming by and getting louder and then receding again in the into the distance. I should say that each of these phrases, there are notes written down, but the performers have some improvisational freedom there. So what we are really concentrating on is a shared way in which we can articulate the same notes in different ways. So the notion of improvisation here wasn't just so that it would be easy for me as a composer. It absolutely fed into the way that the same material can be articulated differently. So that was the final few minutes of the second interlude, and you probably noticed that as we came out of that huge climax, that our fingers went beyond the instruments and into the air, And some people might see that as a kind of some sort of theatrical gimmick, but actually it was really, really significant gesture that came to me, in the sense that what we had ended up doing was taking music to the same place where Beckett was trying to take language. I want to move on to the other two pieces that I composed: 6 residua after Beckett for solo violin, and 5 disjecta after Beckett for solo guitar. I won't have time to go through the residua pieces, and we're going to hear a filmed performance of the 5 disjecta. So, however, they both share similar aesthetics in response to Beckett's work. Obviously, they don't set any of Beckett's text. What they do attempt to do, though, is to set Beckett's techniques, the ones I was telling you about earlier, as a basis for a technical approach to writing for those instruments. I'll go back to the Beckett quote that I mentioned earlier, because this really is a very important basis upon which the both residua and disjecta were composed. And just pay attention to the very obvious implications of the titles. Residua, what's left over, what's left of something more significant, and disjecta, what's rejected, what's thrown away. And it's just to remind you again of Beckett's lines. He said, "The more Joyce knew, the more he could. He's tending towards omniscience and omnipotence as an artist. I'm working with impotence, ignorance." And then he says later, "My little exploration is that whole zone of being that has always been set aside by artists as something unusable, as something by definition incompatible with art." And so this is where Beckett ends up. He's writing the sort of literature, even that word seems too grand for it, that most writers would not use. He's emphasizing dashes and silences and incomplete sentences. It's almost like as if the narrator can no longer fully speak. And I wanted to take that idea into the realm of writing or composing for instruments. This whole idea of going against Walter Benjamin's notion of oratic art, the aura, this notion that the artist is writing or composing or creating something that is perfect, that has a kind of a truth in its beauty. And there's a kind of an aesthetics of beauty, almost a cult of beauty, which has been the story of European art. And here we have Beckett sort of using the unusable, taking advantage of materials that are essentially deemed incompatible with art. And so to translate that to my own composition relating to violin, which itself has a tremendous tradition of auratic art, its whole repertoire is full of it, and of guitar as well, how to find ways to make music from instruments in a way that was incompatible with that history. So this set me off on a completely different pathway. If you consider, for example, that I'm a performing guitarist who has written 2 guitar concertos and written 12 etudes. My whole business thus far was to make the guitar speak and sing in the most articulate way possible, using all the means of the virtuoso. But Beckett was getting me to think in the complete opposite direction. How to make music out of bits of music which would be disjecta for most composers. How to get music from the parts of the instruments that don't normally speak, that can't really speak. And so I'll just go through, we're going to hear all the disjecta at the end of this. So hopefully you can just keep in mind, I'll go through some of the ideas that I was bringing to each disjecta. The first disjecta actually is, I should say about all the disjecta that they are semi-improvised, and the notation is built on a kind of an aleatoric system. There was a real difficult challenge here, not just in these disjecta, but in all composition that is absorbing improvisational practices into its notational realm, which what is the word does as well. And I think this is going to be one of the big challenges in the future, certainly for composers like myself who work in the spaces between improvisation and notated composition, what Adorno calls the crystallization of the creative impulse. So you may see from the scores that I've given you that there's a big challenge in notating what I wanted to do. You'll see in any case that that most of the piece is built from something that's usually not used at all. It's not a proper pitch, and so I'm asking the guitar to create something from material, as Beckett says, which is essentially incompatible with art. Those parts of the instrument that normally don't create or are used to create the perfect auratic piece in the Benjaminian sense. Okay, so that's the first one. So the first one relies tremendously on a lot of improvisation and gesture. This is another one that I wanted to point out, that the actual physiognomy of the instrument becomes the basis for sounds. I'll hold on to the term musical sounds, but the notion of some people may know that you can hit a guitar or make sounds, but the idea that I do this, that this actual sound is created by the very shape of the instrument, and so the gesture in the music becomes significant. It's not a pitched note, it's not a harmony, but it's something that maybe within the context of a performance can make sense as a gesture. The second disjecta is a series of harmonics. And you know, harmonics are not uncommon in music, but the entire piece is made up of harmonics. But one thing that I wanted to try and capture was the microtonal differences that occur, you know, when harmonics are played. If I can try and think of an example here, would be and you can hear that. Maybe that's a better example. That both are the same pitch ostensibly, but the guitar will always offer up slightly different degrees of pitching. So again, that becomes a feature of the language of the piece, that you have these slight distortions, which are normally we strive to get rid of them from our playing, but actually the performer is encouraged to embrace them in this piece. I should also say there are using parts of the instrument that are normally not played as well, so you get this idea of so this is a very unusual part. It's like a latent sound within the instrument, and I also use this connection between to find this strange other world in the instrument. The third one is based on a very simple idea of hammering down and just playing here and so forth. Again, it's quite aleatoric in its composing. The fourth one is perhaps the most virtuosic and traditional one, and again, you will notice, the attentive ear will notice that the same material is used. This notion of this Beckett's notion of using the same material. I used to think that notion there, where the same material comes back, but it's played with different volume levels, different levels of articulation. And this becomes a very interesting way of developing material. You're not developing material through motivic development or through the sort of minimalistic repetitions that we hear in Reich, but we're actually developing material through the ways we reiterate something. Through the ways we reiterate something, if you get my point. And the last one is a kind of a lullaby which runs through all the three pieces that I've composed. It's kind of my Beckett tune, and I do use elements of performing harmonics on this side of the fretboard, always seeking out the darkness in the instrument, always trying to seek out what was previously the unutterable in the guitar, trying to reveal parts of the guitar that could never speak again. Interesting that when the album was reviewed by a very good reviewer, and God knows there aren't that many, he assumed, not having seen me perform, I'm imagining, that the 5 disjecta were for prepared guitar, and I took that as a real compliment. Actually, there's nothing prepared, it's just a different way of playing the instrument. So trying to seek out, as I say, those hidden stories within the instrument, but also those stories which can't really be told. So that's the struggle for the composer, is to try and say something with materials that are incapable of saying it, which is the same thing as Beckett trying to say something with the mere materials of words. What is it that Winnie says at the end? What happens when words fail? So here are the 5 disjecta.